says, "Hi, Starbaby. What was the most complex piece of kit to master as an EWO in the F-4G?" And of course, it was the APR-47. No real question about that. The system was really complex if you very much got into it. So there's two aspects of it. The first aspect is it easy to use? And it was remarkably easy to use. Couple of controls that you needed to know about, good design, good ergonomics. But mastering it, which was the question, was an entirely different kettle of fish, and most EWOs never really mastered it. They knew the basics, they knew some tricks they could pull, but only a handful really got into things like, what does it mean if the elevation valid bit is set at 0 versus +1, or something like that. And all of those had implications for how you actually employed it. So Mike L., how many pairs of underwear did you bring on deployment? And the answer to that question is it varied by how many were actually clean at the time I packed. The Norbica, my question to Starbaby would be, what was the APR-47 prone to malfunctions? It was actually pretty reliable, and I can't think of many malfunctions that I ever had in it, although I did have one that was on a combat deployment in Provide Comfort, in which the system was just not ranging right. It was just not doing the job. But none of the internal bits, the built-in tests, showed that there was a problem. And I flew it on a couple of sorties, and I said, it's not ranging. And the maintenance guy said, well, why are you the only EWO who says it's not working right? And I said, naturally, because I'm me, because I'm the only guy who knows what he's talking about. So we down-checked the aircraft and stopped flying combat missions with. When we got home, we found out that both the mid-band and the high-band cables were bad. But we did not have a capability in the field to sweep the cables and check them out. So that was the only failure I can think of, and it was a 1 in a million dual cable failure. All right, so John Minter. Hi, Starbaby. As an experienced EWO, how do you regard the EA-18 Growler, and do you think the Air Force should still have a dedicated electronic warfare aircraft? So I can't say a whole lot about the Growler because I've never flown it, and having a couple hours in the Boeing sim isn't really a substitute for that. So it looks like a well-designed piece of kit. It also looks like one with high drag and high weight on a small airplane. But it's not really easy for me to critique it one way or another. However, the Air Force should absolutely have a dedicated electronic warfare aircraft, aside from the Compass Call, which is, of course, a dedicated EW aircraft in a C-130H and moving to a business jet. Let's see. Question, does the F-4 feel like an old fighter now? This is Haken Engman. Haken? Sorry, either way. Yeah, of course it feels like an old fighter now. It was an old fighter then. All the F-4G tail numbers were converted from jets that were built in the 1969 set of orders. So we all have 69 as the first two numbers in our tail number. And yes, it felt like an old fighter. It smelled like an old fighter. There was no new airplane smell in the F-4. It smelled like 30 years of vomit, sweat, boxed lunches, chicken bones, and spilled urine, which is, a really unique smell that I don't necessarily recommend as something you want to hang from your rearview mirror in the car. And I used to wear a patch all the time that said F4 Phantom 2, somebody over 30 you can trust. So you got to really embrace it. Mike L., would you consider the EA-18 more of a weasel than the F-16? It certainly has the potential if you download the jamming pods and put harms on it to some extent, and it has an ECMO in it, or an EWO, so naturally that gives it a leg up on the Viper. The Freckle Puny, how does the F-4G compare to the F-16 CJ in the seed role? So this is a question that I get asked a lot. You have to be very careful about that because the F-16 is still with and it's not a CG. It's a CJ, now renamed CM, that does the seed. And it's an operational weapon system. So we're not going to get deep into the comments. It's a pretty interesting, although very small and compact piece of kit, and it just doesn't compare, even with the technology advantage, well when you're looking at 52 antennas scattered around the airplanes, plus having an electronic warfare officer. So it's a kit that's designed to give the F-16 a credible ability to shoot harms, and it does that. But it was never intended as the next Wild Weasel. It was intended as an interim solution while the next Wild Weasel was built, and that did not happen. Mr. Eggman again. Could the F-4 still be utilized successfully today in combat if the radars, weapons, and possibly engines would be upgraded, since dogfighting is something of the past now? So anybody from an F-4 background is going to tell you never to assume that dogfighting is a thing of the past now. But a lot of dogfighting, when we do it in training, depends very heavily on the skill of the aircrew as much as it does the capability of the aircraft. If you put new engines and new radars and modern kit in the F-4G, I still think it would be credible airplane, but you're still dealing with an older aircraft and an older design, and it would probably be a better move if you simply took the F-15EX and converted it into a Weasel-type airframe. Which actually gets into my next question from the Freckle Puny. Would the F-15G for the seed roll have been a good idea, or would this have been overkill? So in suppression of enemy air defenses, there is no such thing as overkill. So everybody thought in the 90s that the follow-on Wild Weasel would be an F-15E airframe. That was the expectation. McDonnell Douglas had a program called Headhunter where they went through several experiments. And one of the things they did is they mounted the F-4G's chin pod on an Eagle to see how the aerodynamics were, and they flew it, and the aerodynamics are terrible. The Eagle nose is very susceptible to airflow disruption, and that can cause undesirable handling capabilities. So the chin pod was not the answer. So the next answer was a technological advance. It was a new set of antennas, slightly curved, kind of flat plate antennas that went on door 3 left, 3 right, and the little panel in front of the windscreen on top of the nose. And those worked pretty well. They didn't give you 360 degrees of coverage. You'd have had to put something else on the tail. But the Headhunter program did not pursue go any farther. And the Boeing company now, which of course absorbed McDonnell Douglas, has plans to convert the F-15E/EX to something that looks a lot like an EA-18 on a Strike Eagle airframe. So putting the ALQ-99 systems on board can be done. The plans exist. I've reviewed them. It just takes money and significant pots of money. But I think it would probably be beneficial. But we may have to see how good the new EW system called EPAWS is on the aircraft. And there's potential to develop, I think, EPAWS if you did something about the antennas in order to really turn it into a good hunter-killer system. Let's see. Mr. Angman, question, is there anything survival in today's combat environment which is not stealth? And of course it is. Stealth, radar low observability is a big deal. And it's useful, and it always works to do something for you. But it is not the be-all and end-all. It's not a Romulan cloaking device, and that's Romulan cloaking device, not Klingon cloaking device. It is not an invisibility screen or anything like that. And so when you are operating at low altitude, and what we see in Ukraine now is aircraft to survive are operating at very low altitudes, then it doesn't matter how big your radar cross-section is if you don't have line of sight to the sensor. So tree lines, hills, terrain always makes a difference. And if you can block line of sight to the sensor, you can really adjust the ability to detect you in favor of the aircraft. The downside is if you've blocked line of sight to the sensor, it can't see you, but you can't necessarily see it, which makes it harder for a Weasel to do its job. There would have to be a lot of popping up. And we worked low altitude in the F-4G, so there is a lot of popping up, figuring out the environment, sniffing or sampling, and dropping down again. Ian Saxon, when you had your head down in the screen during high concentration acquisition or evasive maneuvers, were you still aware of spatial positions or the pilot pulling hard G's? So if you're actually looking at the APR-47, that is right in front of your face at this level. So there's no hunching over. When you are down in the radar and you're staring in this rubber hood, okay, that's when you had to be aware what was likely to go on, because a sudden onset of G could bury your helmet in the hood because you're already bent over. And now you have to keep the front of your helmet and your oxygen mask off the stick. So there have been a couple times where I actually had to wrench myself to the side, ram my elbow down on the panel, and literally hold my helmet up in order to keep it off the stick. But since the F-4G can't maintain that kind of G's for long, it was always a short-term event. And that I remember happening a couple times. As you get more time in the jet, and this applies to the Strike Eagle as well, you learn, your subconscious learns to anticipate what's going to happen next with the aircraft, and you're much less likely to bang your helmet off of something because you just know when it's coming and you've already taken measures to mitigate it. You stiffen up or you reposition yourself. It just happens. You don't even have to think about it. Oh, this is hard. Okay, so there's entirely too many consonants in the wrong place. So it's GHASHPL, which I'm just going to call gash. Hello, what were the main maneuvers when a missile is coming for you from short, medium range? Was going down to gain speed and bend the missile any good? So that's one of those things where we're not specifically going to discuss any avoidance maneuvers that may or may not be used versus a SAM. There are maneuvers. We do use them, and your energy state is very important. And when you start maneuvering in a fighter, you start bleeding off energy, and the way to get your energy back is to use altitude to keep it or regain it. So the sideways answer to the question is you're definitely going down whether you want to or not, because you cannot afford to get slow. All right. Christy's watching my back here. I'm saying I don't think he's allowed to say that. So let's see how my non-answer worked. David Smith, without going into classified detail, how big of a gap do you think the gap is between U.S. and NATO versus adversary EW, ECM, ECCM, and NCTR? I have no idea what NCTR is. So we'll target the first three. With respect to electronic warfare, we're able to see, and everybody's able to see, quite a bit in Ukraine. And we know that the Department of Defense misfocused its electronic warfare operations to countering radio-controlled IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, particularly after the Gulf War, when the Air Force gave away the F-4G and the EF-111, we lost a lot of expertise. The Army retired a lot of expertise. And so what we see in Russia, for example, is that every maneuver brigade should have an electronic warfare company. And at the military division, well, it's above the division level. It's more like a corps or military district level asset. There are actually electronic warfare brigades. And they use them. They have used them well. We see constant complaints from Ukraine on the effectiveness of Russian EW, and the Chinese have to some extent followed suit. So I think that the U.S. and NATO are still playing catch-up, and not to throw any spears at NATO, but NATO countries have been underfunding their military for decades because they're confident in a U.S. security umbrella, and the war with Russia has now, I think, changed that paradigm a bit. So we'll see if any of the electronic warfare enterprise gets any better. The Freckle Puny. Are you aware of the Tornado being considered briefly for the follow-on Wild Weasel role? Would it have been a good idea given the Germans and Italians utilized the Tornado ECR for this role? So there was consideration as far as airframes go for a follow-on Wild Weasel where the Tornado ECR would be, because the ELS, the emitter location system on the Tornado ECR, is a Texas Instruments product. And so there's a lot of Texas Instrument products in an F-4G Wild Weasel at the time. But the downside of that is that the U.S. was not going to buy an air-to-ground Tornado strike airplane. That simply was not going to happen. If we wanted to use and spend the kind of money to buy a viable platform in that respect, we'd have bought the Strike Eagle, which we did, and we should have invested in a Wild Weasel variant of the Strike Eagle. So yes, actually, the Tornado ECR was briefly considered as a follow-on Wild Weasel, and it was discarded because it is A, foreign-built, and B, half as competitive as the best competitor, which, of course, was the Strike Eagle. All right, Clay, thanks for my time. Clay, you're welcome. That wasn't really a question, but I'll get you in there for asking it. Mike L., what's your favorite Star Trek episode? Mine is The Inner Light from Next Generation. Okay, so if we're going to include Next Generation, it is Yesterday's Enterprise. Hands down. It is gritty, it is dark, and it is extremely well written and well acted. And of course, almost any episode with John Delancey as a guest star is going to be good, excepting perhaps the pilot. Let's see. Is the F-16 the best multinational option for providing air power for Ukraine? I get asked this a lot. The F-16 is the easiest multinational option because so many countries fly it, and a number of those countries teach other people to fly it. So there's a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of maintenance infrastructure, there's training on the aviation and maintenance side, and so it's the easiest and the most widespread. And I think it's a good choice. There are plenty of people who argue that the Gripen should be on the list, but the Gripen has no significant training infrastructure behind it from a multinational standpoint. And there are a couple points about the Hornet, particularly after the Aussies said, well, we have a bunch of F-18s. And there's some training infrastructure behind the Hornet as well, so I wouldn't want to rule that out. But as far as availability goes and the possibility of getting secondhand F-16s that do not have to be completely refurbished from scratch, it's probably a good option. Let's see. Were you amazed at how long the F-4G stayed relevant to combat? This is Neuropilot asking the question. And no, what I was amazed is that it was so good that the Air Force let us all go without an obvious follow-on. And my understanding is the F-4G is fast compared to the EA-6B. Your understanding is correct. So aside from having afterburners and the fact that I have been at Mach 1.55 in a G model, the Prowler was derived from the Grumman Intruder, and it was never intended to be a fast jet. So as a mission commander, there were two aspects of having the Prowler in the strike package that were my biggest pains in the neck. Pain in the neck number one is that their airspeeds were low. Fighters are zipping around at 480 plus knots ground speed, and the Prowlers are cruising along at 420 or 450 on a good day. And the second is that there's a lot of electromagnetic interference when they turn the jammers on, so sometimes they didn't hear radio calls on the first try or stuff like that because the EMI trickled through their systems. But yes, the F-4G is much faster. The Freckle Puny, do you ever fire an AIM-7 or AIM-9 from either an F-4G or an F-15E? No, I did not. I did. There is a case where the inadvertent firing of an AIM-9 off a Strike Eagle happened in Allied force, and Ugg Lee and I were in the lead jet when our wingman inadvertently fired an AIM-9. That's the closest I've been. I did not see it when the jets were out of position, so actually 2 was in front, so we were not threatened. We were going to fix it all after the weapons delivery. And as I recall, when I got the radio call that said lead, 2 just fired an AIM-9, we were upside down in 20 degrees of dive with 5 seconds to release on a pair of 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs. So it was not my biggest concern at the moment. Avgeek Joe, how would you kill a SAM site like an SA-15 or an SA-10 with an F-15E that lacks a harm? So I'm going to defer that largely in that the F-15E has a lot of SAM kills. And I've got a couple in the F-15E, and the range at which they can potentially engage a stationary target has expanded. But something like an SA-15, if you had good position data on it, guys in Allied force killed SA-6s and SA-3s with AGM-130s, so that would be the old template in terms of SAMs, is to use a long-range weapon system that you happen to have with 2,000 pounds of cosmic catastrophe as the core and drop it on them. It works like a champ. We have video. Let's see. Ian Saxon. Any favorite possessions, mementos from your military flying career? Yeah, so I've got patches, of course, and I have my helmet, and I have my helmet bag, which has a giant YG-BSM patch on the side. And I still have the last 2 G suits I flew with. I get to keep my original G suit because normally when you leave an airplane and your final flight, you land, the fire truck shows up, people show up with fire extinguishers, something like that. It involves a lot of squirted water. And in my case, when I got out of the airplane after my final flight, having logged 1,010.1 hours total in the Phantom, 2 of our intel specialists met me not only with fire extinguishers and so on, but chocolate syrup and whipped cream. And so, needless to say, coming out of that experience, I was a mess. And the guys in life support, in order to get the chocolate syrup out of my G suit, had to wash it so many times that when they finally got it clean, they said they could hold it up to a strong light and see through it. And so they trashed it. And I didn't get to keep the original G suit. So I've still got things like that lying around. The occasional T-shirt. I do not have any airplane parts anywhere from my flying career. I wasn't one of the guys that, took an airplane to the boneyard and stole the clock or something like that. I do have, I take that back. I do have some rubber tire shreds from a record-setting attempt. Kevin Dunshee and I, actually it was a successful record set in which Kevin Dunshee and I set the world record for the numbers of cables and barriers taken in a single pass in the F-4. So we blew our nose gear tires, and I have shreds of those. And I have a bunch of arming wires from a lot of the live drops. So on my keychain is the first LGB I ever dropped. And I have other attachments and things for live drops. And a bunch of links from 50 caliber shots when I was flying the AT-6. So now that I think about it, I have a lot more garbage lying around than you might otherwise think. All right. Oops, I'm having scrolling problems, so you'll have to bear with me. Biggles Tintin. Hey, it's good to see you. Was there a pilot that you didn't like to fly with, either because of personality clashes or because you thought they were dangerous? Yes, in both cases. In my F-4G time, I flew with 2 pilots who I thought were flat out dangerous, and one of them was also a complete jerk. So that was piled on top. The other one was actually a very pleasant dude. He was just dangerous. And there were a couple pilots in the Strike Eagle that I thought were raging Schwarzenheimers in the jet. But I didn't fly with them that often, and so it didn't really matter. I'm pretty easy to fly with, and I can get along with a lot of different types of dudes. I think realistically, I might be the one that's the harder of the couple to deal with. Let's see. Neuropilot. Should the Air Force approach EA-18Gs as a dedicated fleet? And I'll get to the second half of that question. And the answer is no, of course not. Why would we want EA-18Gs and get into the Super Hornet variant that is the slowest and ugliest variant as a dedicated fleet? We'd want to take the gear from that and put it on a Strike Eagle so that we have some logistics commonality. They do supply EWOs to the Navy, apparently, for joint duties. Yes, and they have since the 90s, and that is, in fact, why I got out of the regular Air Force in 1999, because I was involuntarily assigned to an EA-6B Prowler spotter. And I told the assignment guys a couple things. The first was if I wanted to fly for the Navy, I would have joined the Navy. And I didn't graduate number one in my class to fly an airplane with a pointy end in the back. David Smith, what's harder on the stomach of the typical Wizzo, dogfighting or riding low and fast in bumpy air? Okay, so I've never been sick in an airplane. And what I suspect is that it's low and fast in bumpy air when it's hot. And in the F4, which had no air conditioning, that meant that you didn't have cool air coming in from high altitude. So that's where guys got most uncomfortable. But it's actually, I've heard, because I've never been in an airplane, a fighter where the other aircrew member was ill. What I've heard is that pilots, when you stick pilots in the backseat, instructor pilots, they're the ones that are most susceptible to feeling sick because they're not used to being stuck in the back of the pit, and they lose a lot of their visual cues that help their vestibular system stay stabilized. Let's see. Biggles Tintin, going from a Su-27 to an F-16, how long would training take to become competent? So I actually wrote an article on this. It's called It's Still Not About the Airplane, and it's published in War on the Rocks. And I laid down that I think a competent pilot is probably going to transition in a TX course, which would be 3 to 4 months. But when they come out of a TX course, they're safe. Okay, they can fly the airplane, they can work the systems. That does not mean they're ready to be thrown immediately into combat. And I speak as a guy who transitioned from an F-4 to an F-15E and then had to start from scratch again on the AT-6. Although obviously I never went into combat in the AT-6. And so you come out of your training safe with a limited degree of proficiency, and really it's expected that you're going to be in the squadron for a time period where you're surrounded by other older guys and gals who can help shepherd you through your development as an aviator in that airplane. When you're just starting out, I'm going to say that it's going to take 3 to 4 years before the squadron is a U.S. equivalent squadron. And that is optimistic. On the back end of it, it might take 10. But what is that based on? That's based on the U.S. Air Force F-16 transition, where it basically took 3.5 years from the time the aircraft arrived at Hill to the time that the Air Force produced their first weapons school graduate. And that's the timeline you should be looking at. By the time you're producing weapons school graduates, that airframe as a system is probably combat ready. The disadvantage with starting from scratch is everything is new. And, there are examples of what happens when you take too deep a bite. And if you look at the German transition into the Starfighter, where you're transitioning from an aircraft, new maintenance systems, different manufacturer, different styles, and the initial transition was a disaster. They killed a lot of guys in the F-104 early on and gave the airplane a bad reputation because it was too much of a leap in one shot. James Nellums. Yes, Starbaby. Who wins in a bar fight? Navy Rios, USAF Wizzo EWOs, or Royal Air Force NAVs? Well, having never been in a bar fight, I'm going to have to speculate. So we know it's not going to be the RAF NAVs because they will already be drunk and uncoordinated by the time everybody else shows up in the bar. So it's between the Navy guys and the Air Force guys. And I'm going to say that it might very well be the Navy guys because they'll be angrier because they don't have a stick in the back seat and they have to operate off a carrier and they have nothing to do but lift weights. So I'm going to assume that that's going to give them some advantage. However, I will caveat that with if it's a bunch of old Wizzos and EWOs in the bar, then we may be old, decrepit, and weak, but we're way sneakier. Neuropilot. The U.S. Navy might want to send its F-18 EF Block 1 jets to Ukraine and get new F/A-18X replacements, and Boeing would be happy. The U.S. Navy might not want to do that. But if there were funding available, that would be an interesting way to do it. You're going to suck it up in terms of readiness for a number of years. And I don't know what problem that solves for the Ukrainians over Vipers or anything else. Any ideas how future CD will look like? I think that future CD is going to be a mix of very low altitude and both RF and infrared low observability. And I may not involve an EWO, but in order to get better at it, it's probably going to have to involve a rebuilding, restarting of the Weasel School so that you actually give a specific course on how to kill SAMs. I think those would be the minimums. I think you're better if you have an EWO in a two-seater. And some computer assistance would be nice. But I think in a lot of respects, there isn't an obvious solution as to what it looks like. Now, if anybody reads David Drake, and who's a Vietnam veteran that writes the Hammer Slammer series, and he postulated in the 80s that the advent of direct energy weapons would completely destroy tactical aviation because line of sight light speed weapons would do it in. And he may very well have a point. So for all those research and development, yeah, we need to get lasers and particle beams and phasers and disruptors or whatever else you have on the PowerPoint slide that you're trying to get money with. The development of those in usable numbers with usable power levels is going to be very rough on TAC Air. Let's see. Biggles Tintin, how long can an F-15E fly inverted? Only asking is I think there's a bug in DCS and it flames out after a couple seconds. I'd have to look it up. And there is probably an issue. The two issues that limit airplanes in inverted flight are usually the oil sump or the engine feed tank. And I can't remember what the limit is on the Strike Eagle. That Penguin has been pushed off the ice flow, and so I no longer remember it. And we never pushed it anyway. So those are what the possible limits are likely to be, or until the crew gets really freaking tired of being upside down. Alexander Vatter, in the 1999 campaign, harm efficiency of 3 and 6.6%. It was long CJ, F-18, and German ECR Tornadoes. Okay, that doesn't look like a question. I would dispute any number that actually was in open source. And there were also alarms launched at the time. Oh, okay. So there was a follow-on question, Alexander. Sorry. Would the efficiency be higher when launched by an F-4G? Do you think the harm served its purpose by suppressing the enemy and not needing them to hit? So it's both. I think that the hit efficiency might have been higher in an F-4G because the situational awareness in the 1999 time frame, comparing 96 G model Weasel to 99 HTS-equipped Viper, the SA in the Weasel was significantly higher because it was actually more data provided to a specially trained crew with an EWO in the back. Whether or not that translates to a higher kill number is purely conjecture. I would tend to say yes. But the second half of the answer is the harm did serve its purpose. I mean, in target areas, I remember going in nighttime in heavily offended in the Kurgivac River Valley and seeing a harm inbound over my left shoulder, and it just sailing out, and I thought that's great because it was a harm inbound, and that is a suppressive weapon, particularly at night when everybody knows there's a harm inbound. And if you're a SAM operator, how much gambling do you want to do as to throwing on your radar and wondering if that harm's going to see you? I mean, the odds are pretty decent if you throw on your radar the harm is going to see you. The F-16s, even though they might have systems and training deficit, were able to do effective suppression in Allied forces. Let's see. Christy, I like David Goldfein's ejection story in the F-16 over Serbia. It's not a question. The canopy landed in somebody's backyard. He made it into a dog shelter. And it ended up in the museum. Okay, so Avgeek Joe, thanks for the question. The Freckle Puny, worst case scenario, MiG-21, MiG-29, or Su-27 come to play with your F-4G. How do you cope, especially if shooting them in the face with an AIM-7 did not work? Well, you leave. The F-4G had really good radar situational awareness. And so if you can't shoot somebody in the face, you've got no reason to take it to emerge and every reason to not take it to emerge. So that is a worst case scenario, in which case you turn around, you run away bravely, and you call for some offensive counter guys and make their day. Neuropilot. Okay, that's another answer in there. All right. It's actually only F-18F and a E-18G, so he's ahead of me. Any lessons from Ukraine that you haven't mentioned yet that you think that are important to call out? This is from David Smith. A lot of lessons from Ukraine I'm not actually going to discuss because I don't want to debrief the Russians on what they're doing wrong. In terms of big strategic lessons, one is that the Air Force, the United States needs to learn that it can't control escalation, and its attempts to try and control escalation when the adversary, the Russians, are willing to escalate at any stage of the game, where they will commit war crimes, they will hit unlawful targets. There is nothing that the U.S. has handled worse, I think, than the worries about escalation and the unwillingness to provide capabilities to Ukraine that might trigger escalation. Escalation is happening every day, and the U.S. has no ability to control it. The second big lesson, and this is for the U.S. and NATO, is the industrial base does not have the warfighting capacity we thought it did, particularly with respect to artillery and smart systems. We have used, by we I mean NATO, we have used ammunition and missile stockpiles as a bill payer for 20 years, whereas you run a little short, you just run the production line down and you buy less AMRAAMs that year. That's turned out to be a critical mistake, and we're going to have to pay attention for that. And I remember, this was first brought to my attention 10 years ago, and it's an old problem then. Let's see. Biggles Tintin. What is my favorite looking aircraft of all time? Not just the ones I've flown and not just U.S. Man, I really like late model P-38s. That whole fork-tailed thing, guns in the nose, superchargers visible from the top. I really like that. Although I also would say that the PBY Catalina has an extra bit of charm, particularly when you put things on the wing racks and guns sticking out the side. Let's see. The Freckle Puny, do you think the RAF is missing a trick in not fielding something like the harm or the previous alarm? And I'll say yes. But I think the RAF, as it always does, is doing the best that it can with very limited funding. I think that the UK, post-Falklands, and certainly post-fall of the Berlin Wall, has been really unwilling to invest in the kind of defense they used to have. And so when you're in a continuous drawdown mode for all your services, you do the best you can with what you have, and the Royal Air Force does pretty well. Warren Chambers, Starbaby, and he puts in parentheses Spock, which is my original call sign, in the F4. On the F4 speed brakes, are they automatic with a manual feature or all auto? The speed brakes on the Phantom are a thumb switch. So you pull back and you slow down and you push them forward and it goes in. So it's completely manual. And of course you can lock them in the in or out position. And I don't remember what happens if they close automatically when you return the switch to neutral, because the times I've used the speed brake myself are very limited, even though I had a speed on the throttles. And my favorite paint scheme on the F-4G, well, the most sensible was the two-tone gray, but man, that lizard paint scheme, the green, that looked very Vietnam heritage. And so heritage, when you're some of the last guys flying the F-4, heritage is a big deal, or at least flying the F-4 in the U.S. Air Force. Heritage is a big deal. And so that Ian Saxon, are we going to get a Starbaby autobiography or two anytime soon? Okay, so it is in progress, but it's slow going. I'm still dealing with very early kind of stuff, and I'm in no immediate hurry to write it, because a lot of my writing time, the brain cells I have to dedicate to writing, is set up professionally. And so I've just completed my first actual nonfiction professional kind of book. I've had plenty of articles. I finished the first draft of that, and we'll see what happens with that when it comes out. But it is also with the degree of humor you would expect from me. And I'll probably, when it comes out, people will end up finding out one way or another. If I did social media, I would tell you, but you're going to have to rely on guys like Mike or Steve Davies to tell you that the book's out. Was AGM 130 as fun to use in real life as it looks? Because it looks fun. This is from Zerber. So I was not an AGM 130 qualified guy. I have no idea how much fun it was to use, but I will tell you that the weapon system was misused not by the crews, but by our command and control. And so roughly 75% of all shots taken, actually launched, were taken against empty holes. And so and a lot of times guys would go up and they were on an airborne combat air patrol. They might fly in ovals for 4 to 6 hours and not get assigned a target and then bring their ordnance home. So we actually had to take the AGM 130 guys and rotate them into normal laser guided bomb dropping lines so they could get some job satisfaction. So AGM 130, I'm sure firing the weapon was fun, although it's very high stress, like any man in the loop weapon. But being in a combat AGM 130 line in Allied force was, I think, not as satisfying on average because you weren't making things blow up every other day or every third day. Aeroflip 97. You said you ate good food in Italy. What was your favorite? Man, so kangaroo. And I am not BSing you. So if you look at Aviano Air Base where we're operating, which is at the base of the Alps, and you go up into the hills, there's a little town called Budoia. And in Budoia was the world's best restaurant. It was Il Refugio. And Monleo was the cook. He took over from his dad, and he prided himself on cooking things that nobody else cooked. And he did a lot of things like grew his own corn to make the polenta. I mean, it was fantastic. And I had kangaroo there, and I had ostrich there. I'm going to have to say my favorite food in Italy is eating Monleo cooked. He had a specialty called Scotch ravioli, which was a handmade ravioli, and he marinated it in Scotch. And that was particularly popular among the fighter aviator set. Although I took a big risk bringing guys from the squadron into that restaurant, and I told them that they were going to behave well, or I was going to physically damage them. And by and large, they behaved well because the food was so good. I also like wild boar pizza if I have to go. Now, unfortunately, Il Refugio is closed. Monleo elected, I think, quite correctly to retire a number of years back. But I did get in there, made a trip back to Italy, last year that he was open, and took my wife because she'd been listening to, a fighter aviator tells you, hey, best restaurant in the world. And like anything else that comes out of my mouth, it's going to be taken with a grain of salt. But she came out of that restaurant thinking best restaurant in the world. So there we go. That was my favorite. Daniel Mudge. Who's the one guy you met that made you question how they somehow got wings? And what did they do to get your attention? So I have a habit, if a guy is either not good in the job or a complete loser or just a raging Schwarzenheimer, I'm not going to mention them by name, okay? Because they can't answer, it's not fair, it's not cool. So I remember one aviator who had a number of near mid-airs and a traffic pattern stall early on in the training program. And I kind of wondered why they graduated the individual and how they got into fighters in the first place. And then the other guy was it wasn't so much I questioned how they became an aviator, because, yeah, they great, and they could suck the situational awareness out of an entire four-ship. But I never recall almost being hit by him when I was in another airplane. The question is, how did he ever become an instructor? How did he fool squadron leadership to the point where they thought he could take responsibility at any time? That's kind of the deal there. And what, the things they did to get my attention, I mean, they did stupid stuff, like I've mentioned, or the instructor in question was not willing to own up in debriefs. He once basically concealed the tape, claimed that something had happened that didn't happen. It wouldn't play the tape because it would have proved otherwise. All right, Captain Crunk. How effective was the AGM-78 standard arm? Assuming on the F-105G it was marginally better than the Shrike, was it any better on the F-4G with its more advanced systems, and did I ever carry it? So this is hard for me to answer because it's all second-hand stuff. I didn't carry it. I didn't practice with it. We didn't simulate it because by the time I got into the G model, the AGM-78 had been taken out of service for rocket motor cracks. And the Air Force ponied up money to fix the Shrikes, but did not pony up money to fix the AGM-78. The guys that I've talked to who carried it in Vietnam said that it had two big advantages. It actually had three big advantages over the Shrike. The first was the seeker was programmable, so you didn't have to swap out seekers in order to cover a different band. The second one was that it had more range and it could make up to a 90-degree turn. And the third one was the warhead was better. So that's the best I can give you, Captain, as a AGM. I've never dealt with it myself. All right, at Timberwolf, a Tornado pilot was on here. He told of, scroll crisis. He told of a boat in the 90s turned its speed on a penny. UAPs read the news. They're in the Pentagon. Have you ever seen anything? I have never seen anything that strange that didn't resolve. I haven't seen any unexplained weirdness. That doesn't mean it's not out there. It just means that I didn't see it. I would not have expected to see unexplained weirdness in the F-4G because the radar wasn't that good. And, I didn't have a targeting pod to slave to the radar or anything like that. So what are my opinions? My opinions are I'm not informed enough to give an opinion. There's always going to be weird things that happen and weird things that you pick up on sensors. And I've looked at some of the tapes and said, man, that's weird. But I really got no answers. All right, Christy, you might be asked this quite a lot, but do you think the EX Eagle 2 was needed? And the second question is, do you like it? So I refuse to call the EX anything other than a Strike Eagle. I don't care what the Air Force thinks. I think that the idea that we would hand it to the National Guard as an air defense asset was foolish, but that appears to have been blue smoke and mirrors. Those are the heaviest, baddest Strike Eagles ever built, and they are absolutely needed because we've demonstrated since the late 80s, really since the Gulf War, that the Strike Eagle is the most employable and employed fighter. And we put a lot of airframe hours. It carries a lot. It's got decent range, although not what I'd call long range, not compared to something like a B-1, even a well-cast F-111. And it's definitely required. How it's going to turn out, it looks neat. There's a lot of growing pains that are like any new airframe with new engines they're going to have to work through. But the guys I have talked to who have flown it in tests say it's awesome. So I'll defer to them and say, yeah, great. But yeah, we need them. We need more. And we need to keep the production line open for a long time. All right. Captain Crunk gives me a thanks for my service in live streams. You're welcome. Otto von Fledermaus says, Starbaby, I always look super comfy in that cockpit. Of course, because it's fake. And I actually have a fairly comfortable chair, although you can't see it because I've got the background suppressed, and I'm not going to unsuppress the background because it's a bunch of storage boxes. But the back of the chair I'm sitting in has two upper ejection handles from an F-4D zip-tied to the back, just so I always know where they are. And if I have a conversation I don't like, I can just pull the handles and I'm out of here. Let's see. James Nellums, thanks for humoring my silly question. I'll be more serious now. Do you have a favorite UK castle? So I have two. Dover is awesome. Because it is, well, maybe I have three. Dover is just a fantastic castle. It's got underground tunnels. It's very imposing looking and it's neat. Carnarvon, and I may be honest, so apologies to anybody who's actually Welsh. In the upper northwest corner of Wales is amazing. That's just a heavy, squat, go ahead, make my day kind of defensive fortification. Also in Wales is Conwy Castle. And the reason I like Conway, which is mostly a ruin, is because it's great to walk around, but it has a fantastic river view. It's really a pity that it is a ruin, because there's spots there where people should be living in it and taking in the river view. And I have done the other thing about Conway that makes it more interesting. Well, Dover too. I've run simulated attacks against both of those castles. Coming river for Conway and Dover. If you wanted to practice an attack on a vertical target, the windows, the old Napoleonic era windows that are in the White Cliffs looking out, are a great vertical target. They're hard to find. You have to use references to get there. And you've got no real airspace challenges when you're off Dover. And since we're not under 500 feet, you're not worried about hitting a boat or anything like that. Dover is really good for that. All right. The Freckle Puny. Which fighter, past or present, would you love to get your rear end to for a joyride? So that's the first half of the question. And I'd actually like to get all of me in for a joyride, because just putting my rear end is likely to be uncomfortable and I can't actually do anything, and it's hard to strap in. I'm going to say, and I've answered this before, it's going to be an F-14D. And the reason it's going to be an F-14D is because that completes my deck. I've flown all of the American fighters of the 90s, except for the Tomcat. And it would have to be a D model because it had the good engines and the good radar. The second half is which one to go into combat. It depends on the nature of the combat, because I'm not allowed to pick the F-4G and the F-15E. So in that case, I'm going to say, if we're dealing with a destiny conflict, pretty confident in the AT-6C, a good solid airplane. But I wouldn't want to deal with it in a case where there's a radar SAM threat, or obviously an air-to-air missile threat. But otherwise, I mean, I was very impressed by that airplane, and I think it was perfectly designed for the relatively low-intensity stuff that it was intended to work in. So, and I'm familiar. Ian Saxon, if you could have flown in any operational theater conflict as a Weasel EWO, where would that have been? If I had my druthers, I'd have not missed the first Gulf War. If I'd been a little bit earlier, like if the Air Force's habit when ROTC cadets graduated was to commission them and then send them out into the wild to starve to death until they put them on orders. And so I was commissioned in May of 1988. I didn't get to go on active duty till November of 1988. I think had I gone into nav school immediately, I would have had a chance to catch Desert Storm. And that really would have been my preference, because I had an inferiority complex about that for almost a decade. Big ol' Stanton, if you could go back in time and change decisions made by the Air Force, what would you change? Are there aircraft that you think should have gone into service and didn't make it? I would have, no question about it, I would have built the F-15G in 1-for-1 replacement numbers. That is the single decision that I would have made, because it would have, by default, kept the electronic warfare enterprise going. The second decision was, is it the F-111s, one or two F-111s had been completely my second choice would have been the modernization of the F-111 fleet, and the third choice would have been to cancel the F-35 a long time ago, when it was clear it just wasn't going to cut it, and it was going to be much more expensive than they expected. Neuropilot. Assuming it could be supported, would you think a NATO European partner could acquire the F-15E modified for CD role? No. I don't think any of the European partners has the aviation room to take on a new aircraft, a new supply line, and new maintenance. None of the air forces are large enough, except perhaps the Turks. And the Turks are following a different path. However, if we modify that question and say that you could take European aircraft already in service and modify them for a CD role, then I think there are air forces that might be capable of doing that. And I would actually lead off with Turkey and France, because both of them have the industrial capability to do it with their existing airplanes. Eagles Tintin. A lot of smiles. He says kangaroo and hop it Starbaby. So no kidding. I mean, that's the only time the kangaroo was in Italy, and it was really, really good. Does not, in fact, taste like chicken. Ray Lauterbach. Hello, sir. Do you think that it's a mistake that the 5th and Gen aircraft are single seaters? I think it's a huge mistake. It seems workload saturation is still a very real thing. It is a very real thing. And let me tell you that this mistake has been made before. So the F-16, the F-4 to the F-16, the argument was made with the F-16 that you could go single seat because of all the automation. And that was true in the case of the radar. Even the early APG-66 was probably no worse than an APQ-120 and could be operated by the pilot at the same time they were flying. The mistake that was made was to think that F-16s with Lantern could do low-altitude precision-guided missions at night, and they could not. And they killed a lot of guys trying out before they completely removed the nav pods off the Viper and became Mantern. It was the Mantern pod, the medium-altitude targeting infrared at night. And so I think that mistake is being made again. If you're looking at options where you're dealing with a jamming environment, or you have to manage consort aircraft, perhaps loyal wingmen or something like that, you could easily get to the point where even if you don't saturate a single crew member, you move beyond that single crew member's ability to juggle all the balls that are in the air. And so what you're effectively doing is you're putting a limit on the number of things that can be done in the cockpit because it's only one person. John Minter, after your stay at Lakenheath, are there any parts of British culture that you miss? Man, I initially read that as British cuisine that I miss, and I was going to say, no, are you kidding me? But British culture, well, so, yes, I really miss not tuning into the news quiz, and I'm sorry I haven't a clue, on BBC4 every week for my fix. Because unless you are immersed in British society and politics, you can't get those shows. And so I was able to follow them for about 3 years after I left the UK, but then the jokes started flying over my cranium and I couldn't do it anymore. So that's it. You know, certain comedy programs on BBC4, heck, I don't even know if they're still running. All right, so this is, Jack is smiling. Is the F-4G Weasel backseater role more challenging than the F-15 EWO role? So there's a nuance to that, and you asked about F-15E EWO. And so as an EWO in the Strike Eagle, I'm just mostly a Wizzo, unless I'm the Squadron or Wing EWO, which I was. But the extra EWO things I can do in an F-15E backseater are not any different. So from a battle management standpoint, that's where a big workload is on the F-4G, because you're looking at the entire electronic order of battle, and you have a wingman, or you're part of a 4-ship, and you have to manage the flight. You have to manage the flight's targeting. You have to respond to second-by-second changes in the strike package composition and condition. Whereas the Strike Eagle has its very intense periods, and as a mission commander, you have to do a lot of that, but without the electronic order of battle information. But you're diving into harm is fire and forget. So once I decide to fire a harm and we line it up, it's hit the handoff button, get a ready light, mash down on the pickle button, call Magnum on the radio. But when you release like a laser-guided bomb, you're managing a whole bunch of JDAMs, or something like that, particularly in a dynamic fight, that is really an intense environment. 15E, and you have to, in the case of LGBs, even a laser-guided JDAM, you have to support those weapons to impact. So there's no easy fire and forget when you're dealing with something that requires laser assistance. So I would say that it's not a one or the other. One is more challenging. The challenges are a little different.
So I'm gonna jump in here, Starbaby. Sorry.
No.
Sorry about that. Maybe you can pick maybe 2 more questions while we wrap up this Q&A.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so just for anybody else that's listening, I don't get to your question. My normal habit is to use the comments to post questions and answers so you can get something like it afterwards. And as long as comments are enabled on this, I can get to it. So the 2 questions are just going to be the next 2, because that's fair. Timberwolf, what's your favorite overseas out on the town or larking with the dude's memory with foreign forces? Oh, man. So it's probably dealing with the French and the and periodic parties at Incirlik Air Base. And I was not there for the time that the trees were set on fire. I was there for the time period where a Royal Air Force officer on the third floor and his mates experimented with what happens when you throw out every single thing in the room off a third floor balcony, starting with golf clubs, ending up in the middle with the golf bag, and rounding out with the bed. So that was entertaining. And definitely, the other event is the clown car story, which really isn't mine to tell. And the people whose story it is